Good morning, everyone. I am truly honored to introduce my PhD advisor, colleague, and great friend, Dr. Paul Garber. Paul received his PhD in anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the Washington University in St. Louis in 1980. So he has been conducting primate field research since the 70s in several countries in Central and South America, and more recently in China. Currently, he holds the positions of Professor Emeritus in the Department of Anthropology and the program in Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the US. President-elect of the American Society of Primatologists, founding member and vice director of the International Biodiversity and Primate Conservation Center, Dali University in Dali, China, and associate editor of the journal Science Advances. In 2017, Paul was awarded Distinguished Primatologist of the American Society of Primatologists. Paul was the executive editor of the American Journal of Primatology between 2008 and 2017. He has edited several books and published over 300 papers and book chapters. And since 2017, he has coordinated and led with Alejandro Estrada the writing of several must-read papers focused on primate conservation in high-quality journals. He has trained dozens of master's and PhD students, and for many years taught primate field courses in Central America, training hundreds of young primatologists, many of whom now play key roles in anthropology in general and primatology in particular. So, Paul, please inspire us with your talk titled The Importance of Indigenous Peoples and Non-Human Primates in Promoting Biodiversity Conservation.
Okay. Well, hold, hold on. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Um, okay. First of all, it is my honor to be here. And I thank Professor Pico Marquez for all of his kind words. I've known Julio Cesar for almost 30 years, and I am proud to say we're trusted friends and colleagues. I do have to make sure or correct maybe one thing that Julio Cesar said. He said that I have been studying primates since the 70s, but I just want to clarify that's the 1970s, not the 1870s. Um, I've been studying primates in the wild for some 46 years. And today, a lot of my talk will focus on non-human primates, but I think the point needs to be made that many of the same factors that are driving primate population decline are driving the population decline of other animals and plant species. So I think in that sense, primates serve as really important models. So I have three goals in my presentation today. The first, I'm going to discuss the important role that Indigenous peoples play in biodiversity conservation. I then am going to spend some time examining the conservation challenges facing the Brazilian Amazon, a region that many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with. And then at the end, I would like to spend a few minutes talking about the conservation challenges faced by China in protecting their primate populations. Although many of the drivers of primate population decline are common worldwide, each country faces its own set of challenges, and the challenges faced by China are very different, for example, than the challenges faced by Brazil. So let me begin by saying that non-human primates are facing an extinction crisis. This image I have here are of golden snub-nosed monkeys from a field site where I work in China. Currently, 69% of primate species are listed as vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered, and 94% of primate species have declining populations. In fact, there are only two species of primates that are increasing in size. One of those is the Hamadryas baboon, which has a very widespread distribution. The other is the cat ba langur, an Asian primate that's critically endangered. So even though its population is technically increasing, it has less than 100 individuals in the wild. So even with increasing populations, many primate populations are facing extinction. If we look at the proportion of threatened primate species in different world regions, 98% of Madagascar's primates, which are lemurs, they have 107 species, 98% are threatened. In Asia, 88% of their 130 primate species are threatened. In Africa, 45% of their 107 primate species are threatened. And in the American tropics, Mexico, Central and South America, 44% of 178 primate species are threatened. And one thing I'd like to highlight, there are more species of primates in the American tropics than in any other world region. And so if we are going to save primates from extinction, countries like Brazil are going to be critical in protecting primates. Now, I want to put this in a bit of a context. Primates are the most taxonomically diverse threatened order of mammals. And let me explain what I mean. The most speciose order of mammals are rodents. There are about 2,375 species of rodents. 17% of rodent species are threatened. Bats are the second most speciose order of mammals. There are about 1,335 bat species. 21% are threatened. Primates are the third most speciose mammalian order. There are 521 species of primates, but 69% are threatened. And so whatever information you use, it's clear that non-human primates are facing an extinction crisis. Now, we might ask the question why primates are important. This is an image of a primate I've studied in China. It's a black langur monkey. But if we ask the question why primates are important, first of all, non-human primates represent our closest living biological relatives. And because of that, primates are important models for understanding human health, human behavior, human biology, human cognition, and human evolution. Secondly, primates are considered an indicator or a sentinel species, warning of the deleterious effects of hunting and habitat conversion on biodiversity and ecosystems health. This occurs in part because primates are characterized by a slow reproductive output, so it's very difficult for primates to recover once their population numbers have declined. And so if primates are not doing well in a habitat, then many other species are not doing well. And finally, primates play important roles in predator-prey relationships and as seed dispersers, seed predators, in some cases pollinators, in promoting forest regeneration and carbon sequestration. So primates do play a role in storing carbon because of the tree species that they disperse. And And so primates are important for reducing the effects of climate change. Now, in 2022, Alejandro Estrada and I, and many of our colleagues, including Julio Cesar Bicamarcus, published a paper in the journal Science Advances titled Global Importance of Indigenous Peoples, Their Lands, and Knowledge Systems for Saving the World's Primates from Extinction. And basically, what we concluded was that safeguarding indigenous peoples' lands, languages, and cultures represent the greatest chance to prevent habitat degradation and extinction of the world's primates. And so I'd like to present some information from that paper. But the first question we might want to ask, why are indigenous peoples important for conservation? Indigenous peoples account for only about 6% of the world's population. They manage some 38 million square kilometers of territory. Approximately 24% of global carbon storage above ground are on indigenous peoples' lands. So indigenous peoples' lands contribute again to reducing the effects of global warming, to promoting carbon sequestration. Moreover, about 36% of lands with high environmental value, and that means those lands have a low human footprint, that they've not been strongly affected by human activities, those lands are managed by indigenous peoples. Now, indigenous stewardship for millennia has promoted stable, sustainable forest management through indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge of the resilience of their lands. This is a figure from our 2022 paper. It focuses on a group of indigenous peoples, the Lacandon Maya in Mexico. But the point of this is to show that through hundreds and thousands of years of indigenous knowledge about the resilience of the resources in their environment, and because indigenous peoples practice resource rotation and landscape management, they've been able to live relatively sustainably on their lands. This is accomplished on relying on a broad-based subsistence economy. So indigenous peoples hunt, they gather, they herd, they're involved in horticulture, but they also use a pattern of shifting land use that rarely exhausts or permanently undermines their natural resource base. One good example of this is something that we might call sacred landscapes. In the ecological literature, it's called source sink models. But many indigenous groups have areas of their territory that they consider sacred landscapes. They don't hunt, they don't fish, they don't collect in these sacred landscapes. The result of that is the sacred landscapes then become a source for a source population for other areas of their landscape in which they do hunt and do fish. And so there's migration of, for example, primates from these sacred landscapes into areas where indigenous peoples, for example, hunt, repopulating those areas. And that allows a sustainable balance over long periods of time. Now, if we want to link indigenous peoples and primates, globally, about 30% of wild primate distribution is on indigenous peoples' lands, about 23% on protected areas, and 47% on other lands. And other lands are simply public lands owned by governments or private lands owned by individuals. Here I should point out, I have twin common marmosets from a site where I've worked in northeastern Brazil in the state of Paraíba. And this is a white-headed langur that I've studied in China. 71% of all primate species inhabit indigenous peoples' lands. And this really highlights the importance of indigenous peoples' lands for protecting primates and other biodiversity. Moreover, as their range increases on indigenous peoples' lands, primate species are less likely to be threatened. And again, this probably, and I'll provide some information, relates to the fact that indigenous peoples' lands have a much greater percentage of intact forested environments. Now, here is also a figure from our paper, and this is a comparison of intact forested landscapes on indigenous people's lands. And I'd like to go through this in some detail. So here we have three major world areas: the American tropics or neotropics, Africa, and the Indo-Malaysian realm or Asia. These are lands then with the human footprint less than 4, which means they're minimally impacted by human activities. If we first focus here on the neotropics or the American tropics, if you look at the first bar, about 80% of landscapes inside indigenous peoples' lands represent intact forested landscapes. But you can begin to see as soon as you move 10 kilometers, 25 kilometers, and 50 kilometers from indigenous peoples' lands, there is a consistent decrease in the availability of intact forest because these lands have roads, rail systems, urban centers, mining, cattle ranching, agriculture. So in the American tropics, indigenous peoples' lands have significantly more intact forest than outside those lands. If we look at Africa, actually, we have a very different situation. The amount of intact forest inside and outside indigenous peoples' lands is basically the same. And this relates to a very interesting aspect of indigenous peoples of Africa. The majority of indigenous peoples in Africa are herders or pastoralists. They herd goats and cattle, and so they don't live in forests. They require pasture or grassland for their domesticated animals. And so indigenous peoples in Africa, the majority, do not live in forested landscapes or highly forested landscapes. If we move to Asia or the Indo-Malaysian realm, what we see is something analogous to the American tropics. There's about 50% of intact forested landscapes inside indigenous peoples' lands. It's certainly less than the American tropics. But as you see here, as soon as you move, even within a few kilometers of indigenous peoples' lands, there's a marked reduction, almost halving of intact forested landscapes. And so indigenous peoples and their lands are providing landscapes that promote biodiversity. So in conclusion, many of the same drivers associated with habitat loss and habitat degradation that contribute to primate population decline also imperil the cultures, livelihoods, traditional knowledge, and survival of indigenous peoples. And these include things, like I said, mining, oil exploration, deforestation, agriculture, cattle ranching, all of these habitat fragmentation, all of these contribute. They put pressure on indigenous peoples' lands, and this often then results in the dispossession of indigenous peoples' lands. Indigenous peoples are forced to leave their lands. The result is they lose their cultural identity, language, and heritage. They often are forced to move to urban centers where they are poor, have virtually no access to health care. They lose their connection with nature. And so you lose this amazing knowledge that indigenous peoples have acquired over thousands of years. And this also leads to a loss of those protected habitats and a reduction in biodiversity. And sadly, this occurs despite the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which states that Indigenous peoples have the right to their lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally occupied or otherwise used or acquired. Yet national governments, multinational corporations, agribusinesses, ranchers, and civil conflict continue to dispossess indigenous peoples from their lands. And so, in the absence of protecting indigenous peoples, we lose their culture, their language, their knowledge. They become dispossessed people, and we also lose the conservation benefits of the indigenous peoples and their lands. So clearly, safeguarding indigenous peoples' lands, the sovereign land rights, their languages, cultures, systems of knowledge, I would argue represent our greatest chance to prevent habitat degradation, biodiversity loss, and the extinction of the world's primates. These are two juvenile golden snub-nosed monkeys from a site where I worked in China. So what I'd like to do now is begin with the second goal of my presentation, and that's to focus more on the Brazilian Amazon. Last year, Alejandro Estrada, Vinicius Klein, who I think is out there, just received his PhD from PUC, and Julio Cesar Bica Marcus and I published a paper in the American Journal of Primatology called An Urgent Call to Action to Protect the Non-Human Primates and Indigenous Peoples of the Brazilian Amazon. So I want to talk a little bit about the conservation challenges faced by non-human primates and indigenous peoples in the Brazilian Amazon. Here, this image, the area outlined in red is Amazonia, and the area outlined in green is the Brazilian Amazon. Amazonia is the largest remaining area of tropical rainforest in the world. It's an area of about 6.7 million square kilometers. Amazonia stores about 150 to 200 billion tons of carbon each year, and it's home to millions of animals and plant species. Perhaps it's the most biodiverse area on Earth. There are 9 countries that comprise the Amazon region. However, Brazil is the largest Amazon nation, I'm sure you're aware, and accounts for about 62% of Amazonia, so an area of about 4.1 million square kilometers. Perhaps not surprisingly, Brazil is the primate richest country in the world. There are 131 primate species recognized in Brazil. That's 25% of all primate species worldwide. So clearly, Brazil has a critical role in protecting the Amazon, biodiversity, conservation. Now, deforestation in the Amazon has occurred mainly over the last 50 years. This is a map of Amazonia, but if you focus on the red areas, which are areas of major deforestation, you can see that the eastern part of the Brazilian Amazon has been heavily deforested. This is now referred to as the arc of deforestation. And this area of the Amazon, for the first time in human history, is a source of carbon rather than a sink of carbon. I'll talk about this a bit more in a few minutes. Sadly, deforestation in the Amazon continues. Excuse me. Here is a figure based on data from Global Forest Watch. This a graph lists the top 6 countries in the world between the period of 2019 and 2022, so a 4-year period of tropical primary forest loss. The first thing to point out that 4 of these top 6 countries, Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia, are Amazonian nations. So clearly the Amazon is being deforested at an alarming rate. I also want to point out that the other 2 countries on this graph, DRC, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, is the most primate-rich country in Africa, and Indonesia is the most primate-rich country in Asia. So clearly, worldwide, the greatest amount of tropical primary forest loss are occurring in areas of highest primate biodiversity. The other thing to point out in this graph, which is clear, Brazil stands out in the amount of tropical primary forest loss over this 4-year period. Brazil has lost about 64,000 square kilometers of forest during that 4-year period. Now, I just want to very briefly introduce some of the primates of the Brazilian Amazon. Brazil has many biomes that contain primates. As I said, there are 131 species, but in the Amazon alone, there are 18 genera and 100 primate species, and that accounts for 19% of all primate species. So 19% of all primate species are present in the Brazilian Amazon. There also are approximately 370,000 indigenous peoples living on their traditional lands. However, the Brazilian government only recognizes the land rights of about 55% of these these indigenous peoples, and therefore, sadly, both legal and illegal exploitation of resources on indigenous peoples' lands by non-indigenous peoples continues to occur. Now, 30% of Brazil's Amazon species are listed as primate species are listed as threatened. That's clearly better than the 69% of the world average. And this includes both larger body taxa, like spider monkeys, howler monkeys, and woolly monkeys, but it also includes smaller body taxa that weigh between 0.1 and 1 kilogram, like calamico, Amazonian marmosets, pygmy marmosets, and squirrel monkeys. Here are just a few of the other primates that are present in the Brazilian Amazon, but 86% of Brazil's Amazonian primate species have declining populations. 14% have stable populations. There is no species of primate in the Brazilian Amazon that has an increasing population. And therefore, if business continues as usual, Brazil will be and is facing an impending primate extinction crisis. Now, I want to very briefly talk about some of the drivers of habitat destruction in the Brazilian Amazon. Clearly, deforestation is a major factor. Approximately 20% of the Amazon forest has been cut over the past 50 years. And scientists estimate that once about 30% of the Amazon forest is lost, it'll reach a tipping point, which is referred to as a savannaization or a drying up period. And that's expected to result in a 60% decline in rainfall and an increase in temperatures of between 2 to 7 degrees Celsius. And that will result in the Amazonian forests being converted to dry tropical forests and savannas. And these are habitats that most species of Amazonian primates simply cannot exist in. As I mentioned before, between 2019 and 2022, Brazil lost 3 times more tropical primary forest than any country in the world, almost 64,000 square kilometers. And to put this in a little perspective, where you guys are, and I visited in the past, the city of Porto Alegre is about, the entire city is 500 square kilometers. And so over this 4-year period, Brazil lost in tropical primary forest an area equivalent to 125 cities of Porto Alegre. There is good news, though. And the good news is that in 2023, this past year, forest loss in Brazil decreased by 36%, 11,400 kilometers of tropical primary forest was lost. And so this shows the importance of governments and their policies on conservation. With the new Brazilian government, I think the whole world has hopes that conservation of the Amazon will be at the forefront. That said, Brazil still lost 11,400 square kilometers of tropical forest last year. Now, other factors that are driving this loss in habitat in the Amazon is soy production and cattle ranching. Over the past 30 years, an estimated 80,000 square kilometers of Amazonia has been deforested for soy. And in recent years, cattle ranching has surpassed soy production in altering the Amazonian landscape and now accounts for over 60% of total tree cover loss in the Brazilian Amazon. In 2022, there were approximately 93 million head of cattle that grazed on 380,000 square kilometers of pasture land in the Brazilian Amazon. Now, in 2023, Brazil was the world's largest exporter of soy and the world's largest exporter of beef. But I want to refer to this as an international problem. It's both a national problem, I would argue, for Brazil, but also an international problem. And that's because the demand for these products, they're exported from Brazil, the demand is coming from a smaller set of consumer nations that is encouraging Brazil to deforest the Amazon. And let me show you a little bit of information on this. This figure is from a paper that Alejandro Estrada, Abhishek Chaudhry, and I published in 2019 in the journal PeerJ. Now, we were looking at all of the neotropics or the American tropics, but since Brazil is the largest exporter, these patterns follow for Brazil as well. So here, if we look at, for example, soybean importers, China, India, the Netherlands, Vietnam, and Spain were the major importers of soybean from the American tropics, principally Brazil and the Brazilian Amazon. And similarly, if we look at beef imports, it's countries like China, Russia, and the United States that are driving the demand. And so this really is an international problem, and in my view, will require an international solution. It doesn't mean that Brazil shouldn't be at the forefront in determining what the best solutions are, but unless the demand is decreased from my country, the EU, Japan, China, other countries, then things are unlikely to change. More recently, burning of the Amazon is another problem. In 2023, 107,000 square kilometers of standing forest in the Brazilian Amazon were burned. The Amazon does not burn naturally. All of these fires were set by humans, and 97% were set illegally. The burning of the Amazon, not surprisingly, contributes to a net increase in carbon emissions. And so it's important for Brazil, but also for the world, to work with Brazil in decreasing these carbon emissions that are coming from the Amazon. Now, dam construction is another issue I'd like to mention. In 2020, Brazil proposed a plan to construct over 200 hydroelectric dams in the Amazon. If this plan goes forward, it would flood 100,000 square kilometers of forest. Now, taking a step back, there's no question the Brazilian government has a responsibility to their citizens to provide electricity and power. That's not the issue. Brazil has an enormous northern and eastern coastline. Instead of hydroelectric dams, Brazil could use wind, solar, geothermal energy to provide energy for their people. But if instead they go the route and construct these dams, this will have an enormous impact on the Amazon. This also would require removing indigenous peoples from 2/3 of the Amazon. They would be refugees then, forced to move to cities or other areas. And in expressing their concern, Amazonian indigenous communities wrote that the government was forcing on us a development model that does not represent us, that expels people from their lands, ending our food security, destroying our cultures and languages, and killing our forests. Now, for millennia, perhaps as long as 20,000 years with recent archaeological evidence, indigenous peoples have served as stewards or protectors of the Brazilian Amazon. Here in this figure, again, the green outline is the Brazilian Amazon. The areas in white represent indigenous peoples' lands. Indigenous peoples' relationship to their lands and natural resources is grounded in their cultures, languages, subsistence practices, and their systems of knowledge that they've acquired over hundreds and thousands of years concerning the resilience of the ecosystems in which they live. And in this regard, indigenous peoples have much to teach non-indigenous peoples, including conservationists, biologists, and government officials about environmental sustainability. They know how to protect their environment, and we need to learn from them. Now, we examine natural forest cover as a measure of environmental stewardship. The idea being when there's more forest cover, those lands have been better protected. And we compared this on indigenous peoples' lands, what Brazil calls conservation units, protected areas, and other lands in the Brazilian Amazon. And so on this figure here, the areas in white, again, are indigenous peoples' lands. The areas in yellow represent conservation units in the Brazilian Amazon, and everything else is other lands, private lands or protected, private lands or government lands. And what we found is that indigenous peoples' lands account for about 14% of the Amazon. Conservation units about 23% of the Amazon. But the vast bulk of the Brazilian Amazon is this other land, which is about 41% government lands. And I'll point out this again because this is very important. And about 20% is private lands. The results of our analysis, we found that indigenous peoples' lands have experienced significantly less habitat destruction, 3 times less compared to both government-run protected areas and unprotected areas, and that the presence of intact forest was significantly higher on indigenous peoples' lands compared to areas located even within 10 kilometers of the borders of indigenous peoples' lands. Once you approach the borders, you get incursion of roads, in some cases rail systems, you get mining, agriculture, cattle ranching, all these factors that impact the landscape. Perhaps for us, what was most important, primate species richness, and that is the number of primate species was significantly higher on indigenous peoples' lands than on conservation units and other lands. So, in addition, we found that indigenous peoples' lands have about 340 million, they sequester 340 million metric tons of carbon each year. Indigenous peoples' lands then are a strong carbon sink. Indigenous peoples' lands in Brazil remove 4 times more carbon than they emit. And again, what I've said many times, if we're going to protect biodiversity worldwide and in the Amazon, protecting indigenous peoples' sovereign land rights, cultures, and systems of knowledge is essential to the survivorship of biodiversity and ecosystems in the Brazilian Amazon. Here is a figure from the World Resources Institute. It examines carbon on inside and outside indigenous peoples' lands in the Amazon. Here, if you look at the first bar graph, that's forests inside the Amazon. And what we see here is that although in pink or purplish, indigenous peoples' lands produce some carbon, overall, they sequester or sink 4 times more carbon than they produce. And if you look at the second bar, and these are forests outside indigenous lands in the Amazon, although those lands do sequester carbon, overall, they produce more carbon. They're a net increase in carbon. And you can see here this comparison in pink or purple, how much more carbon emission occurs on non-indigenous lands in the Amazon than on indigenous lands. Now, for a second, I just want to bring this back to a more global perspective. This is a figure from a paper published in 2022 by Wolf and Ripple in PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And again, what you can see in this figure, and it looks at the American tropics, Africa, and Asia, is that areas of high carbon storage coincide with the distribution of tropical forest habitats, these areas in orange, high primate density, and indigenous peoples' lands. So here, this clearly links carbon storage, which is critical for mitigating against climate change, occurs in areas of high primate density, high biodiversity, indigenous peoples' lands, and tropical forests. So the question that I have to pose is, how do we protect the Amazon? Clearly, I think everyone agrees it's critical that we protect the Amazon. It's critical for Brazil. It's critical for the world. And certainly it's critical for non-human primates. Well, is there a way forward? There was a recent study published in 2022 by a team of Brazilian scientists, Da Silva et al., and they argued that the Brazilian government could create a sustainable conservation system to preserve 83% of the Brazilian Amazon in perpetuity, forever. This involves 3.6 million square kilometers of the Brazilian Amazon. Now, what they proposed is this would be composed of current conservation units. About 23% of the Brazilian Amazon is conservation units, plus public lands. Remember, about 41% of the Brazilian Amazon are public lands. They're government-owned lands, plus indigenous peoples' lands. 14% of the Brazilian Amazon is indigenous peoples' lands, plus offer financial incentives to private landholders to set aside just 5% of their land as natural heritage reserves. Now, again, I would argue that this is not simply a Brazilian problem, it's an international problem. And it will require an international solution and international collaboration. Brazil can't be expected to do this on their own. The estimated cost to establish such a conservation system would require an initial investment of 1.5 billion US dollars and thereafter cost 2 to 3 billion dollars per year to maintain and administer. Now, you might think, well, $3 billion a year, that's a lot of money. I would argue $3 billion a year is a trivial amount. And let me explain. First, the US government just earlier this week gave $95 billion for humanitarian relief, for armaments, weapons to Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, and Taiwan. However you feel about whether they should or shouldn't or what's going on politically, the US had a spare $95 billion that they could present for that. So I would argue the amount we're asking for really is trivial. Let me explain. The amount needed each year to maintain the Brazilian Amazon, if we move forward with this plan, in perpetuity, this would protect 83% of the Brazilian Amazon forever. The cost is 5/10,000th of 1%. Let me repeat that. The cost, this $3 billion per year, is 5/10,000th of 1% of the 2021 GDP of the G7 countries, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the US, and the UK, plus China. If those 8 countries provided 5/10,000th of 1% of their GDP each year to preserving the Brazilian Amazon, in collaboration with the Brazilian government, we could protect the Amazon forever. So clearly, the time to act is now. These primates need your help. This is a saddleback tamarin that I studied in the Amazon of Bolivia. So I would argue that each of us, we're global citizens, must do what we can to organize, work collectively, and support primate range country conservationists and primatologists to protect the indigenous peoples, natural ecosystems, and non-human primates of Amazonia and throughout all parts of the world. Okay, I'd like to, in the few minutes remaining, switch to a very different part of the world, China. I've been working in China for the past 14 years, and I want to talk about the conservation challenges China faces and expanding and connecting protected areas. That is a conservation strategy to safeguard the primates of China. These are black and white snub-nosed monkeys from a site where I've worked in China. So, as all countries, China has social, economic, and environmental challenges, just as Brazil, the US, and all countries worldwide. In the case of China, their challenges include balancing development, economic growth, and conservation in response to a large human population. China has 1.4 billion people. That's 7 times the population of Brazil. And China has had a large human population for centuries. China has had a long history, 10,000 years of agricultural production, animal domestication, and deforestation. And I would argue that actually China, over the past 70 years, has changed its natural landscape more than any other country in the world. China also has had rapid expansion of urban population centers. I joke, and Julio Cesar has experienced this. A small city in China has at least 10 million people. We don't have 10 million people in any single city in the United States. Mexico has one, I believe, has one. So over 1 billion people, 65% of the population of China lives in cities. And as you can imagine, it would require massive energy, water, food, transportation needs to support 1 billion people living in in cities and urban centers throughout China. And not surprisingly, given all these facts, China is facing major reductions in animal and plant biodiversity, including primate biodiversity. Now, China, though, has a set of social, economic, and environmental advantages. China, just like Brazil, for example, and Mexico, has an outstanding group of world-class scientists, including primatologists. So they have the human capital to deal with conservation issues. China also has the second largest economy in the world, so they have the financial resources to invest in conservation. The Chinese government actively funds high-quality scientific research, and the government has a stated commitment to conservation and environmental protection. Currently, about 18% of China's land area is designated as national, provincial, or county level nature reserves, but clearly China is going to have to increase that percentage dramatically, and I'll explain this in a few minutes, if they're going to save their biodiversity. Now, China has 26 primate species, so clearly Brazil has 131, very different from China. But China's primate biodiversity includes lorises, macaques, leaf-eating monkeys, snub-nosed monkeys, and gibbons. Gibbons are apes. And so they have 26 species of 7 different genera. Sadly, 2 species of gibbons have been extirpated or lost from China in the past 20 or 30 years. And if things don't change, that will continue. There will be extinctions of primates throughout China. Now, let me sort of put this in perspective. 81% of China's primate species are threatened, but if you look here, most of those species are either endangered or critically endangered. And 92% of China's primate species have declining populations. So clearly, China is facing a primate extinction crisis. Here are just some primates that I've worked with in China. But let me put this in perspective, because to me, this is horrific information. 15 species of primates across all 7 genera have less than 2,000 individuals in the wild. And 2,000 individuals may not be enough for a breeding population. 4 additional species have very small but unknown population sizes, but clearly less than 2,000 individuals. So overall, 19 of China's primate species have less than 2,000 individuals in the wild. This includes, here we have an image of a Hainan gibbon. There are 45 Hainan gibbons in the wild. If we look at, for example, here, the gray snub-nosed monkey, there are somewhere between 100 and 300 remaining in the wild. This on this end here are white-headed langurs. There are less than 1,000 in the wild. So we're talking about extremely small populations. If that wasn't bad enough, virtually all species are distributed as isolated subpopulations. So what we mean, for example, in the case of these white-headed langurs, there are less than 1,000 individuals, but they're distributed maybe in 12 isolated, separated subpopulations. And so the largest single subpopulation that shares genetic material is only 200. So even though we say there are 2,000, there's not a continuous 2,000 breeding population. It's often 100 or 200 or 50. And so I want to propose this idea of a conservation network of protected areas as one of the ways China can move forward to protect their primate species. What we mean by a conservation network is creating an intersected set of protected areas. So on this figure, the green areas are protected areas, and the yellow areas are corridors that need to be created to connect those areas. These corridors then facilitate the safe and unrestricted movement of individuals and genes across what otherwise are isolated subpopulations. So this creates opportunities for gene flow, and it also promotes environmental resistance and animal and plant biodiversity by maintaining natural ecosystem services like seed dispersal, pollination, nutrient recycle, and predator-prey relationships that could not be maintained in any one small isolated population. So by connecting these populations, then you have a way to promote gene flow, dispersal, and expanding the environment and the amount of habitat for what are otherwise isolated subpopulations. Now, let me give you some real examples. I'm almost finished, and I just want to present two examples. This is the case of the skywalker gibbon. The skywalker gibbon was identified in China only about 10 years ago. There are currently about 125 to 150 wild individuals in China. Again, we're talking about an extremely small population. They're distributed in 12 isolated subpopulations, 32 to 34 groups, plus a small number of solitary animals. These gibbons live in small groups of 4 or 5 individuals. 50% of their distribution in China currently is outside of protected areas. And so unless those areas become protected, we're going to lose these individuals. They're hunted for meat. They're hunted for traditional medicine. The largest single subpopulation contains only 6 to 7 groups and a total of 20 individuals. So here, then in the case, we can see that here in these boxes, we have 3 isolated subpopulations. They contain between 3, 2, and 4 groups of these skywalker gibbons. And so what would we need to create and expand the protected areas, reconnect all these isolated subpopulations. But as you can see, if you look at the scale of this slide, in order to connect these subpopulations, China will need to construct corridors of 50 to 60 to 70 kilometers. And these would have to be forested landscapes to enable these populations to migrate across this area. In the absence of this, it's unlikely that this species can survive in China. I just want to present another example. It's very similar. This is the Yunnan snub-nosed monkey, Rhinopithecus pieti. There are approximately 3,500 individuals remaining in the wild. They live in what's called a multi-level society. So there are 24 multi-level societies. Each multi-level society can have 100, 200, or 300 individuals. They're found in 5 isolated subpopulations, and you can see these here, these cross-hatched areas, but they're separated from one another. And if you look on this map, they're separated by distances of 50 to 100 kilometers. The average distance of corridors needed to form this protected area network is 116 kilometers. And if you added up the total length of all the corridors that would be needed to connect all these isolated populations to each other, it would be 1,363 kilometers of forested corridors. Although these snub-nosed monkeys also travel on the ground, so you don't need all forest. What this would look like is something like this, where there would be connections and corridors for safe passage across this entire area. But again, unless this is accomplished, some of these subpopulations will go extinct, and it's likely that over time, by the end of the century, the species may also go extinct. So I want to just conclude by saying that China, just like Brazil, I would argue, is facing a primate extinction crisis. Excuse me. 81% of China's primates are threatened. 92% have declining populations. 73% have less than 2,000 individuals remaining in the wild. All species in China are distributed as isolated subpopulations. So corridors need to be built. China needs to set, I would argue, the ambitious goal of 100% of primate species distribution located in protected areas, or they will lose many of their species by the end of the century. And this would involve, as I mentioned, creating a series of conservation networks to connect isolated subpopulations across what are currently highly fragmented landscapes. Now, there is some good news, I would say, in that I don't know if any other country in the world could accomplish this, but China has the financial resources and the human capital of scientists to prevent further primate population decline and extinction, protect and restore primate habitats, and play a leading role worldwide in primate conservation. So I want to thank you for your time and your patience. And thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Excellent. We have questions. One question from Juan Carlos that I'll read.
Sorry, do you want me to stop sharing?
Yes, you can stop. Well, yeah, you can. You can stop sharing. I have a question that's related to one slide, but it's very general. And I don't know if I'll ask you to answer or someone else maybe. And let's see. Probably Lucero sent another question here. Excellent, or comment at least. Let me go first with the question that Natalia sent. Natalia wrote, does the creation of conservation areas, parks that are our conservation units, which remove traditional population from the site, but still allow humans to enter by paying a fee, in the end affect the environment more than simply allowing traditional populations there? She asks this because of the myth of untouched nature, which she mentions is a problem here in Brazil, and she doesn't know if it is something that happens in other countries.
Okay, well, I can give you my own opinion on this. First, one of the things that we found in our research was there is more in Brazil, in the Brazilian Amazon, there is more intact land on indigenous peoples' lands than on conservation units. And there's greater, in the case of primates anyway, greater primate biodiversity on indigenous peoples' lands than conservation units. Now, I don't know if that is the same for other groups of animals, but in the case of primates, indigenous peoples' lands do much better in protecting biodiversity. My own feeling is I'm actually not a very big fan of ecotourism. And I'll give you my example in China. China is part of its growth and expansion has created a large number of ecotourist areas for primates. These are organized, I'd say, very much on the Asian model, like with macaques, where you go to an area, you feed the macaques jump on you, they take your food, people get injured or bitten. And also, I'll just say for China, there's no attempt in these ecotourism sites to actually teach the ecotourists about the animals. There's no orientation. You buy your ticket, you go in, and you walk around. And so I would say in many ecotourist parks, I'm sure there are some outstanding ones in other countries, but my feeling, certainly in China, that they don't serve the educational role that they could. They should have tourists come in. They should have to sit down for 15 minutes or so and learn about the animals in these ecotourist parks. They should have to learn about conservation. And then they should get a little badge saying, I'm a primate conservationist or whatever, but they need to be educated. I would argue they're not. Secondly, they have too much potential contact with humans, which could spread disease transmission. I mean, some of these sites have temples associated with them in China, for example, Buddhist temples, where the macaques and some of the primates are protected. But I personally think that's not the best route. I understand that ecotourism brings in money. And maybe, for example, in the case of gorillas in parks in Africa, that the money if they didn't bring in this money, these primate populations would essentially be lost. So maybe in those contexts, it would be good, or it has a positive effect. But my experience with ecotourism in China is that there's a lot of land conversion. They build hotels, gift shops, restaurants. And so there's a lot, roads have to be built in these areas to bring people in, rail systems are built. So there's, I would argue, a lot of habitat destruction. We had a case also in one of the species I pointed out earlier, the gray snub-nosed monkey. There are somewhere between 100 and 300 individuals left in the wild. They're found in one national reserve, the entire population. The government, the Chinese government created the site to be an ecotourism site, and they put a gondola or I forget what it's called, where you can ride in the air to get from one part of the site to another. So they have these gondolas or baskets. What that did, by error or chance or mistake, it subdivided. It didn't subdivide the population, but it cut off the gray langur population from about half of their remaining suitable habitat. So now the entire population is found on about 28 square kilometers, where otherwise they would have had about 60 square kilometers. So I know there are many primatologists who are very supportive of ecotourism. If it's done right, I think it has the potential to be very important. But I think for it to be done right, it really needs the input of primatologists, conservationists, not the government. And the last thing I would just say, if I had the ability, I would say it's not ever good to remove indigenous peoples from their lands. It hurts them. It makes them refugees, basically. And it also results in, I would argue, a reduction in the conservation potential of that land.
Thank you. I think you just answered the complement of Natalia's question that was exactly meaning that if we allow people to stay in their lands, if it wouldn't be better than taking them out and then allowing other things. I had a question related to that, but it's short. I'll say now so that you can complement. What do you think about, well, the gorilla case is more like primate watching, maybe classified. What do you think about primate watching of Chinese primates in terms of, would it be profitable? Not in terms of ecotourism, lots of people, but more expensive, more selective, let's say, in terms of people who can pay to go there from a distance with guides that don't allow them to do the wrong things. Do you think it be possible to be profitable in China to safeguard the populations?
I think it would be, but what it would require is a different mindset. As I mentioned, I think the Chinese have used what I'll call the Asian model, where there could be 2,000 macaques at a site, you feed them, you maintain them there so it's easy for people to see them. What I would agree with you, first of all, China has an enormous middle class. So many, many, many people from all over China can come and do come to these ecotourist sites. But like you're saying, and as I was suggesting, there's no education at all about conservation, about the uniqueness of some of these primate species. These primate species, in my mind, are no different than museums in China, museums that have artifacts from emperors. This is the natural heritage of China. About 8 or so of the Chinese species are endemic. They're found in China and nowhere else. So China has put so many resources into the giant panda, and that's very good. But they need to do the same thing with other taxa, hopefully primates, but they need to educate the population. And I would say, to me, ecotourism without education often, to me, doesn't have what the goal, and the goal is to make your population more sensitive to conservation issues and to want to save these animals. And so, rather than what you have is these monkeys come at you from these ecotourist sites, grab at you, whatever. And so I would say if there was an educational component, if they had field guides who could take you to find the monkeys and to tell you about them, that would be much better than the current situation.
Thank you. Juan Carlos, do you want to make your question?
Well, I wrote in the chat option if you want to read, maybe it's fine.
Could you read it to me, Julio?
Yes, I can. Okay, that's fine. So Juan Carlos wrote, congratulations, dearest friend, always spectacular. Could you share your opinion about the real impact in situ that some indigenous people are having on some very endangered monkey species populations? And then he complemented, it is clear that for some indigenous cultures, some monkey species have great value as a food, medical, or pet source, and these species are hunted every day until they reach the limits of local extinction. Some people often ask me if we are doing an idealistic interpretation of how indigenous people care for and protect their monkey species. My response is that we need to work hard as scientists on the ground with outreach activities in each town to learn the reasons for doing that and share information about the value of these species, including authorities to identify the needs of these communities and support them from academy and government, reducing the pressure on monkey populations.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for that question. It is a very important question. And part of the answer is a bit semantic. Indigenous peoples represent a very specific term. And so, for example, when we did our work, there are no indigenous people in Madagascar, even though there are a lot people who have lived in Madagascar or their ancestors for hundreds of years. And even though they might live in a way that one might think of them as in some ways comparable to indigenous peoples have to self-identify as indigenous peoples. And so one of the challenges we faced when we were doing the paper from Science Advances, where we looked at this globally, we could not refer to people in Madagascar as indigenous peoples. And so, first of all, it becomes difficult or a challenge to distinguish, if you will, between what are called indigenous peoples versus other peoples who are living at a subsistence economy, who are hunting, who are cutting down, exploiting the forest, collecting resources. I take your point very seriously. I do agree there is a bit of idealism in terms of the way we view indigenous peoples. There were many lemur species on Madagascar that were hunted to extinction over the last several hundred years by, I can't call them indigenous peoples, but peoples living at a subsistence economy. There are many parts of Asia where there have been primates, other animals hunted out by people that we would call indigenous peoples. So indigenous peoples hunt, they fish, they use their environments. From probably most of their history, though, I would argue their impact was limited because of their traditions and their cultures and their ceremonies. Certainly now with using guns to hunt, that has caused a significant change in the ability of indigenous peoples to hunt and kill monkeys. It also provides an incentive to kill more monkeys than you can eat because you can sell them. So traditionally, people hunted for themselves, their families, but not for commercial purposes. So I think one thing to think about distinguishing is commercial hunting that goes to markets in Brazil, in Peru, Mexico, and other countries that are for restaurants or for people who certainly have other resources to consume. They don't rely on these resources. And I think we have to first try to reduce that impact on hunting. Millions of primates are hunted every year. No question about that. In some cases, in Madagascar, because traditionally they didn't hunt many of these lemurs, but now they do, is trying to get communities to convert to alternative protein sources like insects. Many Malagasy in rural communities consume insects. So I agree with you. We being scientists, conservationists, primatologists, we have to work with the communities we have access to. And those challenges are different in different parts of the world, to have them reduce their reliance on primate meat. Same thing with primates in traditional medicine. Certainly that occurs in the American tropics. It occurs throughout Asia. Many primates in Asia are hunted for traditional medicine. And that, now again, some of that is for local people, but some of that gets sold now on the internet. And the same thing with primates as pets. You can go on the internet and you can buy primates from Brazil, you can buy primates from Asia. So we are facing a difficult problem. And you're right, I don't want to underrepresent how we can solve this problem. I think in some ways, though, the situation in Brazil is unique because the indigenous populations in Brazil, to a degree, are still living a much more traditional way of life. But in other countries, that's not the case. And so I think there is no one solution for all. And I think we need to rely on indigenous peoples because at present, their lands are still doing a better job than other lands. Now, again, indigenous peoples, if they have their sovereign land, and have their control, they can do whatever they want, ideally, so they could change their practices. But I think at this point, they're a better solution, working with indigenous communities, than many other solutions. But I thank you for that question. It's very important. I am idealistic, and so I'm an optimist as well. And so, you know, my job is to hope. For me, I need to hope that we can change the status quo. The status quo, if things stay as they are, many primate species will be lost by the end of the century. And for many of the people listening, my grandchildren won't get to see them, and your children and your children's children won't be able to see primates. So that's sad.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
Lucero Hernani Lineros, who's a PhD student of mine here, wrote, "Thank you very much for the presentation. Threats forest conservation like illegal logging, mining, and even animal traffic is a daily topic, basically because of a false idea of improving quality of life and increasing wealth of the indigenous people. How can we show, or what can we demonstrate to the indigenous people to involve them in these activities, that forest conservation could be also a good alternative to improve their economy situation and their lifestyle? Because most of these activities are illegal, and are done at the local level, but they end up creating a huge impact.
Yeah, I would say if I was an indigenous person, I wouldn't trust um, government officials, scientists, conservationists who come in and tell me they're going to make my life better, but they want me to do certain things. So I think it's a real challenge to build the bonds and bridges. We haven't done so traditionally with indigenous peoples. Um, and there's no question they can see encroachment on their land. In some cases, sadly, it's legal. In other cases, it's illegal. So I think we have to gain their trust, and we have to put in the effort. I mean, all of us, government officials, scientists, social workers, we need to talk to them, but mostly listen to them. What we need to understand is what they need. If we're going to form a partnership, they need to be the boss. We need to listen to them. We need to, often the solutions for conservation are not that difficult, but they're often, we don't listen to the people who are living there, who know what are the cultural solutions that they will agree with. We often impose, we say, you can't do this, you can't do this, or we're going to do this. So I think we need to come in first as listeners. We need to see what we could offer them that is meaningful to them, so that they can continue to live their traditional life. And that is often really hard for government officials who come in with the idea that, well, these indigenous peoples don't know anything. They're not, they don't have an education. I'll tell them what they need to do. And that's why, I had one comment on one of my slides, which said indigenous peoples could teach us a lot about conservation and the resilience of their environments, but we have to listen. We can't tell them what to do. They know what to do, and they know how to live their lives. So I think we need to begin a dialogue. Again, all this will take time. We should have done this 50 years ago. I'll be the first one to say I was wrong. I've been studying primates for 46 years in the wild, and as I've studied them, their numbers have decreased and decreased and decreased and decreased. And part of that was, and I'm just talking about myself, we thought if we studied them, if we learned about these primates, we could protect them. My feeling now is, personally, we don't have to study primates in the wild at all. If we can protect them, if we can save them, then 50 years from now, when there are large populations, we can go about studying them. Our goal today has to be protection and conservation, from my perspective. And that although many of us got into this because we love the research questions, I spent decades trying to study the social organization and mating systems of tamarins and marmosets. But in my view, sadly, I have to say that all that I've learned about these monkeys, none of that will save them. What will save them is if we work collectively together. And to me, it's really important. This is an international problem. My country is driving this. The European Union countries are driving this. We're the consumers. The US is about 4% of the world's population, but we consume 24% of the goods. So, I mean, my country is responsible, and other countries are. And that's why I think we can only solve these problems with international solutions. And that doesn't mean that Brazil loses its sovereignty at all. Brazil will ultimately decide what is best for Brazil, but it's not just Brazil's problem, and that we have to come from the outside if it will help and provide resources to move this forward.
Thanks, Paul. Lara Rames, that is one student in this class, mentioned that she loved your talk and thanked for your time. And she said that the information that you provided is very interesting and important and also concerning, disturbing. So it's like, it's true. Vanessa mentioned wonderful talk. Thanks. Bruna, it was a very nice talk. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul. And I have one final question.
Okay.
That I think well, you kind of answered already during your talk and in this past question, but you mentioned that China has the second largest economy in the world. And so they have the resources, the money, the funds to conserve their biodiversity. The US is the first. And so my question is, do you believe that they are investing in conservation in China and in the US, and that China will act differently from the US, depending on how do you believe that the US is investing the resource, because the US has even more resources. What do you think about that? And also, let's hope that China does a much better job than the US is doing to protect their biodiversity. What do you think are the long-term consequences of these different ways of handling the conservation issues?
Well, it's a really interesting and important question. I would say the US is doing a very poor job, although with the current Biden administration, there is more of an effort for renewable energy and electric vehicles, things like that, battery production, that will make a small dent in global warming carbon emissions. The US, China is the largest carbon emitter, US is second. So again, like I was saying before, this will take an international effort. And my country, everything I've asked Brazil not to do, my country has done. Okay. So the US has not done very good on this. There are two things that might help the US. One, certainly if Trump doesn't get elected. But the other issue is that in a sort of perverse way, capitalism, the US is a very capitalistic country, and capitalism, because renewable energy will be a huge source of income for companies, that I would say it will be, if the US really becomes a world leader in renewable technologies, it'll be because of capitalism, not because the people of the United States want to protect the world and themselves from global warming. I think China is interesting because they're still, as I say, the world's largest emitter of carbon. So that's not good. But because of the nature of the Chinese government, China can impose on its people and on its business community anything China wants. And so the government can, construct these corridors or can dramatically change how they deal with conservation. I think, sadly, the Chinese government's perspective on conservation is not a valid scientific perspective. I still think that they have other concerns and agendas. Certainly, they would like to do like they did with the giant panda, and it gives them great notoriety. But even the giant panda, if I asked how many giant pandas are left in the wild, there are less than 2,000. And their taxonomic status has been, I'll call it maybe upgraded. They were, I think now they're either vulnerable or they're endangered, whereas before they were critically endangered. So I don't think, I'm not, I don't know that China will be able to protect its primates, but also I don't know how any country is going to do this unless they change fundamentally. And the last thing I'd like to say, and I know you guys have been listening to me talk for a long time, what my best advice is, you have to cross a bridge from being an advocate. I would say everyone here who's listening is an advocate for conservation, but you have to go from advocacy to activism. And activism doesn't need to be a scary word. It could be putting on plays to protect primate species in a local city. But we need to do more than just say, yeah, I want to protect primates. We have to become activists. Juan Carlos is an activist. Julio Cesar is an activist. We have to do more. We have to, by activism, all I mean is organizing in groups so that your collective voice is heard. Individuals can do a lot of good things, but groups of individuals can do even better things. And so form a group, form in your school, in your community, and let your voice be known. You need to talk truth to power. And once you do, I think you realize it's not that scary. You have sympathetic people who will listen. But if we're going to save the world, we're going to promote conservation, we need to move from advocacy to activism. Thank you.
Thank you very
Wow.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll end now. Vanessa's there also. She loved.
Yeah.
Paul knows Vanessa. And so thank you very much, Paul. With this, we end your talk, wonderful talk, and see you soon.
Okay, we'll see you soon in Mexico.
Bye-bye, everyone. Yes,
Bye-bye.
exactly. Bye-bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Congratulations.
My pleasure, Juan Carlos.
Bye.